It was the little things that started to seem off. The way Laura, my wife of 10 years, suddenly took a new interest in our neighbors, Jen and Chris. They'd moved in about 6 months ago, a quiet couple around our age with 2 kids. Jen was friendly, the kind of person who always waved hello, and Chris was your typical guy next door, friendly, unassuming, easy to talk to. We'd had them over a few times, swapped recipes, exchanged tools. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I'd thought. But Laura had started going over there more often. At first, I thought she was just being neighborly, but her visits became more frequent. When I asked her about it, she'd shrug it off with a vague, just chatting with Jen, or I'm just helping with the kids. But the frequency of those visits gnawed at me, especially when I noticed that most of the time, Jen wasn't even home. The real tipping point came one Saturday. Laura had mentioned that she'd be stopping by Jen's to borrow something. I just finished working on the lawn and decided to head inside when I glanced toward our neighbor's house. There, through Chris and Jen's side window, I saw her, Laura, sitting across from Chris in their living room, laughing at something he'd said. I froze, watching as Chris reached across the table, placing his hand over hers in a gesture that was all too familiar, all too intimate. My stomach twisted. 1,000 explanations flooded my mind, each one more absurd than the last, but the truth was there, unignorable. This wasn't just 2 neighbors catching up. This was something more, something that shouldn't have been happening. I turned away, feeling the ground shift beneath me. I couldn't shake the image of Chris's hand over Laura's. That small, intimate gesture replayed in my mind, stinging sharper with each thought. Part of me wanted to storm over and demand an explanation. But another part, the part that feared the truth, kept me rooted to the spot. What if I was wrong? What if this was all some misunderstanding? Later that evening, Laura came home acting like nothing had happened, breezing into the kitchen with a cheerful "Hey," as if it were any other day. I wanted to ask her outright, to lay it all on the table, but something held me back. I couldn't bear the possibility that she might confirm my suspicions. So I kept quiet and decided to watch for signs instead. Over the next week, I started paying more attention. Laura's visits to the neighbor's house continued, always under the guise of borrowing something or helping Jen with the kids. But more often than not, I noticed her slipping out when Jen's car was gone and only Chris was home. I'd ask her what she'd been up to, keeping my tone casual, and she'd give me the same vague answers. Oh, just catching up with Jen, or they needed help with a few things. Each time I'd nod, pretending to believe her while the knot in my stomach grew tighter. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I'd seen Laura head over to Chris's place just as Jen was leaving, and I knew this was my chance. I stepped outside, walking as quietly as possible toward the side of their house. My heart raced, my pulse thundering in my ears as I neared the window, hoping to catch some glimpse of what was going on inside. Through the blinds, I saw them again, sitting close on the couch, talking in hushed tones. They looked relaxed, comfortable, like 2 people who knew each other deeply. Then Chris leaned in, brushing a stray hair from her face, and my blood ran cold. Laura didn't pull back. She didn't look uncomfortable. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. That was it. The confirmation I'd been dreading. I backed away, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over me like a crushing wave. The shock hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, barely able to process what I'd just seen. Laura and Chris, 2 people I trusted, 2 people I thought I knew, sitting there looking at each other in a way that I knew all too well. It was the way she used to look at me. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, every glance, every excuse, every subtle change in Laura replaying over and over in my mind. The pieces fell into place in the worst way possible. The sudden interest in helping with the neighbors, the unexplained time she spent over there, the way she'd started pulling away from me even though I'd chalked it up to stress or routine. All of it had been signs I'd ignored because I hadn't wanted to see the truth staring back at me. The next day I made a decision. If I was going to confront her, I needed something concrete, something she couldn't dismiss with a smooth lie or excuse. I wasn't proud of it, but I started watching more closely. Every time she said she was going to check in with Jen, I found myself standing by the window, holding my breath as I watched her slip next door. One afternoon I took it a step further. She'd left for what was supposed to be a quick visit, and I walked over to Chris's house as quietly as possible. I reached their front door and pressed my ear against it, catching snippets of their voices. I heard her laugh, low and warm, a sound I hadn't heard from her in ages. They weren't just talking about simple things, there was an intimacy, an ease that stung more than I could put into words. I quickly stepped back, realizing I couldn't do this. Not like this. I returned to our house, trying to calm myself, but my resolve to confront her grew stronger. I couldn't keep watching from the shadows, letting the doubt and anger eat away at me. I needed answers, straight from her. That night, when she came home, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. I watched her carefully, noting the slight hesitation in her eyes as she saw me standing there, as if she sensed the tension before I even said a word. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as if preparing herself. "Okay. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, holding her gaze. "Laura, what's going on between you and Chris?" For a split second, her face went pale and I knew that my worst fears were real. Laura froze, her expression a mixture of shock and guilt. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed unable to find the words. I watched as she wrestled with herself, her face going from surprise to a kind of resigned acceptance. "Mark," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It's complicated." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, after the long nights and the sickening suspicion, all she could say was that it was complicated. My chest tightened as I fought to keep my emotions in check. "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "Laura, I've seen you. I've watched you go over there, spend hours with him, come back here like everything's fine. You don't get to call this complicated and leave it at that." She looked down, avoiding my eyes, and I could see her trying to gather her thoughts. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I was lonely, Mark. Things between us haven't been the same for a long time. And Chris, he was there, he listened. He made me feel seen." "Seen?" I asked, the word like sandpaper on my throat. "So you go next door to our neighbor and start a whole other life with him because he made you feel seen? And what about me, Laura? What about our life? Did that mean nothing?" She flinched, finally looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but it just happened. I didn't know how to stop." My fists clenched as I tried to keep my voice steady. "You didn't know how to stop?" I echoed. "It didn't just happen, Laura. You made choices. Every single time you went over there, every lie, every excuse, you made those choices." She reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled back, the distance between us growing wider by the second. Her shoulders slumped and she looked defeated. "Mark, please just try to understand. I know I've hurt you and I know it was wrong. I'm sorry. I never wanted it to go this far." I shook my head, my heart breaking as I looked at her. "You think an apology is going to fix this? You didn't just betray me, Laura. You betrayed our home, our trust, everything we built together." Her tears fell freely now, but I felt numb, like I was watching this scene from somewhere outside my body. The woman I'd trusted with everything, the person I thought I'd spend my life with, was now a stranger to me. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "I'll end it. I'll stop seeing him. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." But as I stood there looking at her, I realized that something fundamental had already been broken, something that couldn't be fixed with promises or apologies. I didn't know if I could ever see her the same way again. I stared at Laura, feeling an emptiness I couldn't describe. She stood there, pleading with her eyes, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. "You can't fix this, Laura. You've already crossed the line over and over again. You've broken something that can't just be put back together." Her face crumpled and she wiped her tears with shaky hands. "Please, Mark. I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped loving you. I was just confused, lost. It wasn't meant to go this far." I clenched my jaw, fighting back the anger and hurt. "You keep saying that. You didn't mean for it to happen, you didn't want it to go this far, but it did. Every time you walked over there, every time you chose him over me, you made a choice, Laura. And now we're both living with it." She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, as if searching for words that would make any of this easier. "I'll cut off all contact with him," she said finally, desperation evident in her voice. "I'll end it for good. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark." I sighed, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "You should have thought about that sooner. Before you lied to me, before you let him into our lives and turned everything we had into this." A long silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the regret in her eyes, the shame, but it didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the betrayal that had ripped through everything we had. "I'm going to need some time, Laura," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I don't even know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded slowly, a new sadness in her eyes. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll give you the space you need, but please just know that I love you. I want us to find a way through this." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure if I even believed her anymore. Well, If this was love, then why had she done it? Why had she chosen someone else right next door, knowing it would destroy me? That night I slept on the couch. I couldn't bear to lie beside her, to pretend that things were anything close to normal. She stayed in our room, and the silence between us stretched into the night, cold and unforgiving. The days that followed felt surreal, like I was walking through someone else's life. Laura was there, in our house, trying to pretend things could go back to normal, but I knew they couldn't. She'd betrayed me, and it wasn't something I could just brush off. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was her with him, my own neighbor, someone who had shaken my hand, stood in my home, and acted like a friend. I kept my distance, going through the motions while trying to decide what I could live with. I thought about moving out, giving myself the space I needed, but something kept holding me back. Part of me still clung to the life we'd built, to the memories that had once meant everything. But another part, the part that had seen her with him, knew that those memories were now tainted. One evening, I found myself standing in front of her, unable to hold it in any longer. "Laura, this isn't working. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay." She looked up at me, her face pale, her eyes full of a sorrow that mirrored my own. "Mark, please. I'm trying. I'm willing to do anything to make this right." I shook my head, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. "There's nothing you can do to change what happened. You chose him, Laura. You let him into our lives, into our marriage. And now, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know I broke your trust. I know I messed up in ways I can't undo. But I'm begging you, don't give up on us." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of my decision settle over me. "I think it's too late. This marriage, it's not what it was. And I don't think either of us can pretend it is." Her face crumpled and she covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Watching her break down felt like a final goodbye to everything we'd once had, to the life we built that now felt like a stranger's. The next day I contacted a lawyer. Divorce was a word I'd never imagined would be a part of my life, and yet, here I was, facing it head-on. The process was painful, but with each step, I felt a small piece of myself return, a strength I hadn't felt in weeks. Friends and family reached out, shocked by the news, but I kept the details to myself. The betrayal was mine to carry, and I didn't want anyone else tainting my memories more than they already were. Moving on wasn't easy, and I won't pretend that I forgot everything we shared overnight. There were good days and bad, moments of relief and moments of regret. But through it all, I reminded myself that this choice was about reclaiming my life, my peace. And as for Laura, I don't know where her path will lead, or if she'll find what she was looking for. All I know is that my path is now my own, free from the shadows of betrayal, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can finally breathe.